Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Crystal Bassett. I'm a senior engineer at ITERRAS and the technical chair for the Illinois section of ITE. Before we get started, I'd like to highlight an upcoming social tomorrow evening in Chicago. We're hosting our summer happy hour at 6 p.m. at the New Line Tavern, located at 201 Clinton Street, where you can meet the section board and fellow ITE members. We have a jam-packed presentation on parking solutions for livable communities coming up. Our speakers are Lindsay Bayley from the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning and Jane Wilberding from HNTB. In the next hour, Lindsay and Jane will inform us on how to strike a balance between providing adequate parking while creating a more livable and vibrant community. They'll provide a brief history of the issues associated with parking policies implemented in the past, explain the adverse effects they have on cities, celebrate the substantial momentum for reform, and discuss opportunities for our cities and region. That said, I'd like to turn this over to Lindsay and Jane so they can introduce themselves and begin their presentation.
Okay, thank you for having us here today, and I am looking forward to talking more about this. So my name is Lindsay Bayley, as she mentioned, and I am the program lead for Safe and Complete Streets at Chicago's MPO CMAP. I have been here for 16 years, and when I first got started, we were working on the Go to 2040 long-range plan, and I raised the importance of the issue of parking in that plan and have been somewhat of a parking nerd ever since. So that's why I'm here today. And I guess it was 2019, Jane Wilberding and I partnered up with Tony Jordan out in Portland to co-found the Parking Reform Network. So I will hand it over to Jane to say more about what she's working on now.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Wilberding. I'm a senior mobility manager at HNTB, where I work on parking management, curbside management, transportation demand management, complete streets, and active transportation projects throughout the country. A lot of that is really focused on parking and right-sizing the parking footprint and getting our curb space really optimized. And, in addition to all that, Lindsay and I were very involved in co-founding and being involved with the Parking Reform Network, which is a nonprofit that advocates and educates on all things parking management. So we'll be getting into a lot of the work that we do at our respective organizations, as well as within the Parking Reform Network as well.
And I think, is there a poll that we can launch to see who is here in attendance? Do we have policymakers, practitioners, or activists? Let's see if that, okay. Can you take a second to answer the poll of what best describes your role? I don't know how long this goes.
We're almost there. We're at 80%.
Okay.
Okay, there are a couple of people lagging behind, but I'll go ahead and share.
Okay. All right, a lot of practitioners. I think I would put myself there too, and engineers, planners, that's kind of where we fall mostly. And let's see, how much do you know about parking reform? Would you consider yourself a shupista? You know a little or somewhat, and then totally new? Give it another second and All right. A lot of the knowing a bit about it. Well, today, Jane and I are going to talk about, we'll start with sort of the problem of that we have created as practitioners in the last 50, 70 years. And that's the problems associated with an excess amount of parking. And then we'll talk about parking solutions for livable communities, and Jane will lead in with some case studies and tools and sort of the future of what we see as how to create more livable communities. As planners and engineers, we've been trying to accommodate cars in cities for most of the last century. And as hard as we try, it never quite seems to work. These efforts have unfortunately had a huge impact on just about every other aspect of our life. The main way that we've been trying to accommodate all these vehicles in our cities is by increasing the amount of space for them. More lanes on our roads, more parking spots, parking garages. And this comes at a cost. We have higher prices of goods that'll cover the cost of that parking lot. You have increased space between buildings, which makes it harder to walk from one to the other or bike. And that cost gets wrapped up into what you're paying for your housing or your office rents. And just having all of this parking encourages people to drive. So that leads to increased congestion and pollution. At CMAP, I worked in many different communities, from quiet suburban downtowns to really vibrant city neighborhoods. And while the built environment is different, people will generally walk a little bit further in the city. The parking patterns are often very similar. People want to park directly in front of where they're going, and they don't want to pay for it. So if you've got a popular destination, that parking that is closest, free, or very cheap will be full. And the parking that requires you to walk a couple of blocks or pay more usually has parking availability. And besides all of those externalities that I mentioned, having too much parking, they're just providing it costs a lot of money. We've found sort of on average, a space in a surface parking lot is about $5,000. Building structured parking can be around $40,000. And depending on the complexity of your water table, underground parking can be $80,000 a space. I've heard some over $100,000 per space. And we all end up paying for these spaces in one way or another, even if you don't drive. If your parking is included with your housing, it makes your housing more expensive. We have a lot of cities facing housing shortages, and this was a study looking at how much the average cost of parking would increase your rent. And they found out it's about $225 a month. And the numbers from Chicago are going to be a little bit higher than that. And I know that when I was a renter, $225 less in my rent would have been really nice. I would have gladly taken that deal because I had an apartment, it had parking, and I didn't have a car, but I was still paying for that. And then on top of all these other things, I mean, really, the main issue is how much space cars take up. If you look at the aerial imagery of places with high parking ratios, you'll often find that there's about the same amount of land dedicated to vehicle storage as to living space. And maybe it's even more, or maybe it just means there's no greenery, no trees, because you had to make room for all this parking. And sometimes that's at the expense of those revenue generating activities. And of course, traffic. Nobody likes traffic. We all complain about it. Congestion makes us mad. Voters respond to it. So there is that political will to widen your roadway, add more parking, or make sure that developers put the parking in with their building. And for a bit, it's easier to get around, find parking, but faster driving and easier parking means more people are going to drive. Why not buy a cheaper house a little bit further out if it takes the same time to get around. And soon enough, we're back to congested. And to quote Jeff Tumlin while using his graphic, every city in America is trapped in this death spiral, thinking that just one more lane is going to solve that congestion issue, or maybe Elon Musk's underground tunnel will do it, but it never does, because the role of transportation is not about solving congestion. We really have no control over that. That's an economic problem, not an infrastructure problem. Congestion is the equilibrium point between supply and demand in a growing economy. So when we've got more parking, that invites more traffic. We're hearing so much about the issues associated with climate change, whether it's flooding, heat waves, or forest fires, and the smoke that we're breathing from another country's forest fires. And a lot of cities specifically are taking action, creating climate action plans. And I tend to hear a lot about electric vehicles, but that really doesn't address a lot of the other issues associated with just providing the space for the vehicles, regardless of how they are powered. And we have a parking reform member, Ryan Martin. He's also a Portland PSU grad student. He did a study of land use in Portland and found that 20% of the city is dedicated to off-street car parking. And I guess that is often, if you line it up with the urban heat island map, it aligns quite closely. And I think, yeah, we don't necessarily understand how much of our cities have become space to store vehicles. This is a graphic showing that in the span of just 40 years, how much of downtown Hartford, Connecticut became parking. That's done by one of Parking Reform Network's advisory board members, Norm Garrick. And a lot of this is because of parking requirements or the mandates to have parking associated with different uses. This 1954 Planning Advisory Service memo or report from the American Society of Planning Officials that I didn't even know existed basically says that we have no idea how to understand or guess the number of parking spaces for different uses. And yet we still did it. We still published those guides and people followed them. And this is what we've ended up with. We have communities that don't really know why they have a certain number of parking stalls for each different use, but they follow the guides or they look at the communities surrounding them and just kind of copy what they did without thinking about the context. And basically you end up with the situation that we are in, where you provide more parking and you get more driving. And it is kind of a cyclical cycle. And so we want to talk about the solutions to doing it a little bit differently. I guess first I'll start with a little bit on a graphic of how we got here. When you have, like I said, the parking associated with each use, kind of a typical development that we've created with minimum parking requirements. You've got your schools, your offices, retail, each area has its own parking. So maybe in a typical morning, you have your parents driving their kids to school on their way to work. At the end of the day, go pick up the kid, maybe drop them off at the park. So go back to run some errands, get the kid, head home. And all of this movement along the arterial creates a number of conflict points, a lot of turning movements and all this activity going from one location to the next. In a slight rearrangement of the buildings in relation to the parking and the street network, you can have sort of that mixed use park once district. So it doesn't mean that people aren't driving. It just means that maybe they come in and park in their one destination, and then from there, you can walk to the next destination. Maybe the kid can cross the street all by themselves to go to the park. You can go grab your groceries on the way back to the car and head home. So this simple configuration basically results in only 2 conflict points, half the quantity of parking, half the land area, 1/4 the arterial trips and vehicle miles traveled, and 1/6 the turning movements. And also, from my opinion, this basically means that the land is twice as productive in terms of revenue generating activity. So that's how one strategy, having that centrally located shared parking, can lower your overall demand for parking. And I grabbed this graphic from Twitter. This was a study of downtown Louisville, looking at one of the city blocks where they have these 7 enormous parking lots, who all together combined pay only 1/4 of the property taxes of the single apartment building shown in this image. So that's what I mean by productive uses in the land. We often get communities coming to us asking for advice and technical assistance. And in this particular community, it's a northwest suburb whose residents have been calling on the village to create more parking. And I created this map, and that circle has a 1/4 mile radius. That's about a 5-minute walk. And the pink areas shown on this map are their surface parking. So it currently covers about 30% of their downtown. And again, this really isn't a supply issue. And this is this is downtown Evanston at the same scale. And that's their surface parking. And when we have people in Evanston complaining that there's just not enough parking, we have to communicate that Evanston is not trying to compete with the parking at a mall. You cannot compete on that level. You would really have to destroy so much of what is drawing people to that location. And also, you already have a lot of people who live there. So we're not, it's comparing apples and oranges. We won't be able to provide the same kind of parking as you find it in the more low density suburbs. This is my neighborhood in Wicker Park, and this is the surface parking close to my house. And this is an area with a population density of over 27,000 per square mile compared to Evanston's 9,500. I tend to hear that people think that when you're going to have more activity and more people, you're going to need more parking. But it generally turns out that the opposite is true. So I created this graphic because, again, I'm a visual person. Same 1/4 mile radius. The top row is a suburban mall, and then a couple other commuter rail suburbs, and then my neighborhood of Wicker Park. And the first column is parking, surface parking area. The second one is building footprints. Then we've got street network. The 4th column is transit. And the last one is the number of people living within that circle. So what we find is the more parking you have, the less place, and the more place you have, the less parking. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about supply and demand and where congestion comes in. So Econ 101, if you took it, you might remember you got your supply curve, your demand curve, and that point where those 2 lines cross is called the equilibrium. And for just about every aspect of our lives, whether it's your food, your housing, your clothing, your cell phone bill, that is determined by price. So what is the right price that makes it so that suppliers can continue to produce and make a profit and demand can be satisfied? In the US, the only instances where we don't use price to balance supply and demand is when it comes to our roads and our parking. Instead, we use time. How much time are you willing to circle the block looking for parking? How much time are you willing to sit in traffic on your commute? Congestion is simply what happens when the demand for supply or the demand for mobility equals supply. It's the equilibrium point, and it is the constant. So if we're not talking about pricing, trying to solve congestion really isn't going to work. As we increase our parking supply and our roadway capacity, it will eventually fill up as long as there is still activity that people want to go to. Congestion is the constant, and we can't solve it. So when it comes to parking, the Donald Shoup approach of Reform 101 is to first stop requiring the parking associated with each use. So no more costly parking mandates, and let the developers can still build parking, but maybe not at some arbitrary number that we don't really even know if that's the right number. And then you look to your curb parking, which is the most valuable and most convenient, and you price it so that you can get the turnover. You want about 1 space available per block, and take that revenue, don't put it in your general fund, but bring it back to the block where it's collected to make the place better, whether it is free Wi-Fi or more transit or additional housing, but keeping the money there. I know that a lot of times, I'm guilty of this too, you look at all these cars on the roads or in the parking lots and you think there's just not enough room. We need to accommodate more. And really, it's just that cars take up so much space. And I went through and counted the people in these cars, and all of them in those 2 lanes could very easily fit in a single bus. Not everybody wants to take a bus, but it doesn't mean that we can all fit, because really the geometry in our cities, especially in our more dense environments, it's limited, and it doesn't matter if our cars are electric or self-driving. We can't accommodate everybody in a car and still expect our cities to thrive. So we really, when we're thinking about parking, we also have to think about how people are getting around. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jane to talk more about case studies.
Thanks, Lindsay. And so here I'm gonna, I'll be talking through some case studies and tools that you may find helpful in your work, and just on a day-to-day basis that address a lot of the tougher issues around parking that we've been talking about. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to be kind of just talking about these parking lot maps that were developed by the Parking Reform Network. So something that cities really struggle with is just identifying how many spaces they have, how many parking spaces they have. Not only is it difficult because it changes, but a lot of them are privately owned. So, it's hard for a city to, know exactly how many spaces that Walmart has and Starbucks has, and if they're combined, and if they change, and if they're shared or not. So this is a surprisingly difficult question that a lot of cities run into. And it's also very difficult to visualize because, it feels like it's not enough constantly, but then when you kind of zoom out and look at it, it really is a difficult problem to solve. So if you go to the next slide, one of the PRN members, Thomas Carpenito, was the parking lot map creator, and he used OpenStreetMap GPS data to map all the parking facilities and structures in the top 50 US cities. And, this not only does this really visualize this issue, but we also have some stats on each city's populations and reform statuses, so you can easily compare them to each other. And so what he did, if you go to the next slide, is actually develop a parking score for each of these cities. So the higher scores, or those ones that you'll see at the bottom, are ones that devote more land to parking compared to the average for a city of the same size, versus, vice versa for the lower scores. And, spoiler alert, a lot of the cities on the higher that have the lowest scores were built before cars were around. So it's kind of an indicator of, what kind of city you want to be in, and what just how impactful having minimum parking requirements really is. So then if you go to the next slide, you can, all of our data is open, so you can also do fun things like this. Someone from Streets Blog did a fun little, why go to a national park when you can go to a national parking lot map. So that's, you can find those there. And in addition to that, if you go to the next slide, more seriously, Axios did a lot of articles that were really fun and exciting on these, and actually had really good conversations with local advocates about, just what they're doing and what can be done. So it really has started to spur action in these areas as well, which is really exciting. And then if you go to the next slide, but what is really the core issue? Again, it's the minimum parking requirement. So if you go to the next slide, I wanted to kind of highlight just a couple of case studies, of what's going on in terms of minimum parking requirements and what is the impact. So Buffalo, New York was actually the first city to eliminate minimum parking requirements citywide. And that was, I think, around 2015. Seattle also had a pretty comprehensive reduction beforehand, and they were really seen as kind of leaders in the space. And if you go to the next slide, there's been some research around that, and it really just shows that after eliminating minimum parking requirements, 59% of permitted housing used the flexibility of the code, and 68% in Buffalo. So the majority of new development, and if you go to the next slide, that's housing. And so the next slide shows like commercial development or just general development. And, most people want the flexibility, and as opposed to, having this requirement. And, these are really powerful numbers because this saves the city and the developer a lot of money. It opens up a lot of land for other uses. It makes it more walkable. And if you go to the next slide, this is, the results are really compelling. This is another, study from Seattle, and they essentially found that there is, about 18,000 fewer offsite parking stalls than there's about a 31% decrease, and that just is a testament to the fact that, just because you eliminate minimum parking requirements, you're not going to get no parking, but it's just more advantageous to the developer. They know what they want, and they're going to build in accordance to that. It's not necessarily something that needs to be mandated. And, having 30% is not detrimental to the project, but it's something that has a really big impact when you apply that citywide. And think about those maps that we were just showing. Imagine 30% less. That's a big deal. And so then if you go to the next slide, we wanted to, those are not isolated incidents. Those are just two examples. And something that, as a practitioner, you'll go to your client or your boss or your council member and kind of suggest or say, what about eliminating minimum parking requirements? And they'll say, well, where has it been done before? And what does that look like? And has it been successful? And so we really wanted to create and showcase this minimum parking requirements map to really show people that it has been done in so many other places. So if you go to the next slide, we started this in collaboration with Strong Towns. And so when we got hold of it, we had just under 300 entries, and now we have about 1,500, which is very exciting, just from researching. And this shows, it's a really powerful tool. If you go to the next slide, it kind of goes through some of the ways you can use it. So, first of all, in the bottom right-hand corner, it highlights cities that have citywide, like Buffalo would be the red. So those are just the red dots. But you can also do, there's a legend on top based on the scope. So if it's just in a center area versus citywide, that's highlighted. There's some FAQs about how to use it. And it really allows you to filter based on, what your particular case interest might be. What if you're really just focused on transit-oriented development reductions or TDM, or, where has it been, on a city center or, just for commercial uses, and you can toggle for population. And, this map, there's 1,500 entries. There's a lot of places that are very big and very small that have done this policy and seen very positive results. So if you go to the next slide, we also, something else that's important about this map that we really like to highlight is that, we have a link, it linked to the zoning code. So the actual zoning code, people can literally kind of copy and paste it over. And so we have, we've developed some kind of like best practices in terms of just TODs, citywide, TDM, and parking maximums. And, you know, there's, you know, different cities from across the country that, you know, we wanted to highlight what they're doing. So if you go to the next slide, and it, you know, we've talked with many cities and really helped them actually make this happen. These ones are specific ones that have kind of come to us afterwards to say, oh, your map was really helpful and really getting this off the ground and making this policy a reality, which we love to hear, of course. And it just goes to show that, you know, it's been really helpful. And if you go to the next slide, you know, it's been really helpful in, you know, making this not an exception, but a standard in cities, that it's no longer an exception to have a city that has no minimum parking requirements, but it's something that we should really be standardized. And I just pulled a quote there from someone from Fayetteville, Arkansas, which is one of the first places to eliminate minimum parking requirements just in the downtown area. And it says, and, you know, he's just reiterating what we've already known, is that you know, these developments that you thought you would never be able to use because it's the parking put such a burden on the developer, were very quickly purchased, redeveloped, and are now in use. So it's really enables you to liven up a downtown. And, you know, looking forward in terms of next steps and how to take this to the next level is, you know, taking it from that local level of everyone is just doing, you know, you know, every small town is eliminating it, to making it a citywide or a statewide reform. So recently, in the last couple of years, California and Oregon have passed reforms prohibiting parking mandates near transit statewide, which is really exciting because, you know, it takes out so many more strings. Yeah, as opposed to like going to each town and having all those little dots on a map, you can just make the whole thing, you know, follow a parking reform. So that's really exciting and something we're looking forward to doing more of in the future. So if you go to the next slide, but, you know, we want to go beyond minimums. It's not just about off-street parking. So if you go to the next slide, we also did the Parking Reform Network, created a parking benefits district guide for activists, and it was featured in the 2022 APA Illinois State of Transportation Planning Report, which is a really great publication that they do every other year. I recommend everyone reads it. And if you go to the next slide, so parking benefit district, you know, managing on-street parking is just as critical as off-street. Especially, you know, if and when off-street parking requirements aren't there. And the best practice states that parking should be priced, as Lindsay was saying, basically at the lowest point that spaces are still available. So, you know, if it's cost too high, no one's parking there, you know, this isn't about price gouging. But if it's too low, then you can't find a space, and then, you know, customers can't access the business. They're not going to go there. And so, you know, but believe it or not, people are typically not interested in wanting to pay more for parking, but through a parking benefits district, it makes that more palatable because you're taking the revenue generated from paid parking and putting it back into the community. So even though you don't love the idea of paying for parking, you know, the businesses, and you have a say in making your downtown more, you know, maybe it's you use the money for increased landscaping or benches or something like that. So we created this playbook to really enable cities to understand, you know, what are the fundamentals, what does an action plan look like, you know, how do we make it more equitable? And then if you go to the next slide, we did a lot of work on case studies for, you know, and we talked to each of these cities, just the ones in the US, about, you know, what their parking benefit district process looked like, you know, what they use their money for, how much of it is used for that area versus not. And it can be found on our website. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to be talking about and kind of building on this, something that we really encourage cities to think about is, developing win-win solutions. Parking is a really important, it really enables other positive solutions to occur. And so I really wanted to highlight what those look like. So building off of the parking benefits district, case studies, there's, parking and active transportation. That's a win-win solution right there. So in Portland, Oregon, they were able, there's a pictured on the top right are the different parking benefits districts there. And so one of them was able to use that money to build a bike lane. And that's the bike lane that you see in the bottom right-hand side. And so you can kind of use that, so you're taking from the parking and you're using it for active transportation infrastructure. So another example, if you go to the next slide, again, in Portland, the transportation wallet, and again, parking benefits district. So they took the money from on-street parking revenue through the parking benefits district and created a transportation wallet. And the transportation wallet is a really exciting program because you're allowing individuals who are low income to have access to a variety of transportation and mobility modes that they probably otherwise wouldn't be able to afford, and they're deeply discounting them or offering them for free, especially in those district areas. So kind of using parking to achieve your equity goals is another win-win. So if you go to the next slide, and there's some exciting things happening here locally as well. Very recently, the Connected Communities Ordinance was passed. And it's been building up from several other TOD ordinances in which minimum parking requirements were eliminated around transit stations in Chicago, but it's been opened up and further opened up into bus corridors, and those are the green and black lines that you see there. So it's basically, and the buffer is a 1/4 mile to a 1/2 mile, so it's basically covering the entire city. And within these TOD areas, there's been some really exciting, if you go to the next slide, win-wins for land use through parking, because not only have they expanded the areas that you do not require minimum parking requirements, but they've introduced parking maximums to these areas, especially in it's especially exciting for residential, because that's something that we see a lot of issues around. So parking maximum requirements are a great way to really increase density, ensure that you're not over parking your development, and creating a more walkable community. So, creating, achieving land use, better land use through parking is a really great win-win as well. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about parking and air quality, or, and curbside management. So in 2019, New York City initiated their commercial cargo bike pilot and to test cargo e-bike deliveries. And so much of our curb space is dedicated to loading. I mean, everyone sees these giant loading trucks on the street, and how much of that loading and goes into each individual business wanting their own parking space for a large loading truck. And when one business sees that their neighbor's doing it, they want to do it until the whole street is kind of just a lot of loading, and then that results in no spaces being available for customers who's that's kind of the intended user there, and having poor air quality. So and we're also seeing those trucks getting bigger and bigger, and that's a huge issue for urban areas like New York or like Chicago. And so again, New York came up with this pilot, and if you go to the next slide, there were several studies done about it, and they found that it saved 7 tons of CO2 emissions per year per bike, which is about 2,500 tons of CO2 in total. And using e-bikes for delivery cut CO2 emissions by 90% compared with diesel vans and 33% compared with electric vans. So it's, you know, you don't necessarily immediately think about parking and how that, you know, creates air quality issues, but it really, there is also a win-win there as well. And then something that Lindsay started to hit on that I wanted to speak to a little bit more is electric vehicles. So if you go to the next slide, there's not a lot of definitive policies. You know, we're building them up right now around EVs. But, you know, again, as Lindsay said, changing the engine doesn't solve the problem around cars, you know, and could in fact undermine a lot of the exciting work we're doing around parking reform, specifically minimum parking requirements, if we, you know, continue to kind of perpetuate the same policies that we see in vehicle parking. You know, there is really a big opportunity to, you know, think more broadly about how introducing this new infrastructure can create meaningful change. So, you know, parking policies of today, what we know has not worked in the past is when it's not shared. So when parking is not shared between a private business, you know, so there's a restaurant and then you build more parking for the barber shop next door, and then you build more parking when it could be shared. You know, it's not working having minimum parking requirements. So the having them required and mandated is also not helpful, and not having the flexibility to really change that. You know, if you do want to change minimum parking requirements, you have to go through city council, and that's like a whole, you know, it's very challenging, and a lot of times developers don't do that just because it's so complex. And so EV parking policies of tomorrow should really, you know, identify these and kind of flip the switch a little bit. So share goals with land use and broader mobility initiatives, like some of those win-wins I've been talking about. You know, don't prescribe and require additional EV parking spaces for every land use. You know, again, that will create more sprawl. And then, you know, just making sure they're flexible to accommodate technology advancements in the future, and flexible to accommodate the needs of each individual business or community that they're serving. So, you know, there are opportunities there, but we really want to make sure that, you know, we're not just kind of, again, just switching the engine and not changing anything at all. And then if you go to the next slide, that is it. We really enjoy talking about this, so happy to answer any questions. Thanks. So.
And we did not include a link to the Parking Reform Network for some of the resources that Jane mentioned, but it is parkingreform.org.
I can put it on that. I can put in the chat maybe.
Thank you, Jane and Lindsay. If anyone has any questions for them, please feel free to type in the question and answer box. I see that Jane has provided us with Parking Reform's website.
I'm going to stop sharing.
We'll wait a couple of minutes to see if any questions pop up. I do want to remind everyone that this webinar is recorded. We will be posting it on our YouTube channel. You could just search for Illinois ITE's YouTube channel. That'll be there. And then if you happen to rewatch it, have a question for them later on, feel free to reach out to me, Crystal Bassett, and I'll try and get you some answers. Oh, I see. We do have a question. Will you be able to share the slide deck document after the meeting?
Sure.
All right. And then the next one, parking related. How have removing minimum requirements addressed handicap parking availability?
See, Jane, did you want to take that? So I think that's definitely an issue that is of interest to us. We did a webinar about, I guess it was the disability world and parking reform in general. But one of the issues that became very apparent here in Chicago was the abuse of handicap parking hang tags, so that people who didn't necessarily use a wheelchair or need the accessible parking were abusing the ability to park for free in very convenient locations, which led to some of the laws being changed so that you had to have sort of a higher requirement, like physical disability, in order to get a hang tag that made it so you didn't have to pay. But I think that there are definitely concerns about making sure that we have accessible parking on our city streets and at convenient locations when we're not requiring parking broadly. And I've seen some places where they just have a couple of accessible parking spaces, and that it could be part of the code of, if you're going to have parking, this is how it should be. But do you want to add anything to that, Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add that, getting parking management right really does enable you to have more space for ADA, especially at the curb, because spaces are available. If if things aren't managed correctly or priced right, you end up kind of pushing those people out a little bit more, not thinking fully about what that looks like. So I think that it really goes hand in hand, because the less space it's very easy to prioritize a curb for outdoor dining, and then in just saying the only spaces that are here are ADA accessible versus having a whole line of free parking. So just thinking about and prioritizing who you're managing it for, and setting out those goals early on is very doable, and can help both parties.
Oh, you're muted.
Crystal, you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that. We do have another question, a couple more actually. How does Chicago having sold parking affect the ability to meet the 85% goal?
Oh, that's definitely a Jane question.
That is a great question. So, the concessionaire agreement gets a lot of flack, which it does deserve. But the one thing that it did do is that it enabled us to price the curb more closer to right, because prior to the concession agreement, parking in Chicago was like 50 cents or $1
25 cents an hour.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
At least in the neighborhoods, yeah.
Super low. I think it was like 50 cents down.
Oh, 50.
Yeah, so,
okay, in downtown.
Really low regardless, and it was always full, and no one of course wanted to raise it because it's extremely politically unpopular to do. And so having the concession agreement brought in the private sector to really price it right. And parking in Chicago is probably a little more expensive than in other cities, but generally more spaces are available, and I would say that we're much closer to achieving that 85% than a lot of other cities because of it.
And I would add that the parking meter deal does not restrict the city's ability to change the rates. Right. It does say that if they change the rates and it causes the private company to lose money, the city has to make up that difference. But it's still possible.
Yeah, especially if you're increasing it to achieve 85% utilization.
We can't hear you.
Another question. Have you done any research on the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of park and ride at commuter or transit stop? Do you have any recommendations for the new park and rides on red line extension stops?
I have not done that research. I don't know. Jane, do you?
This is an interesting question because HNTB is actually the program manager for the red line extension, and I've done some work on those parking ride locations. So we're on it, but I would just say generally there have there's definitely been some research about, the effectiveness of park and rides, and that you don't necessarily have to have them there. There's a lot of times that they're overbuilt and they're extremely costly, especially to the transit agencies, because, as we kind of talked about, parking garages are extremely expensive, and commuting stations parking tends to be associated with safety issues, because they tend to be used for a very specific point in time, and then are completely empty. And so then there can be associated with, crime, and kind of just, it's a big open space that's completely empty most of the time. So a lot of the work I've been doing around that is really trying to get the size right, and think about how it can be eliminated if at all possible, because again, there's a lot of issues around having large parking lots there, and instead using that money that they would use for a parking lot for more frequent bus service that more people can use, rather than those people that just have cars.
Or housing next to the station, that
exactly.
you could live there and then walk.
Yeah, so the best practice is to not really have them, but if you have to have them, thinking about how those spaces can be shared when they're not in use, and how they can be potentially redeveloped, when the demand goes down, because hopefully even that you will invest in transit-oriented development and not need them in the future.
Okay, I think this is the last question. Would autonomous self-driving taxis or Uber change how cities or developers further approach parking in the future?
I guess I could try first. So autonomous vehicles, the thing is that there's different models right now of how they could be deployed. So there's some models in which they are individually owned, and then there's other models in which they're a fleet. So it'd be more likely that you would not own your own car. So in the fleet scenario, it would be, more opportunities to have remote parking, and then you kind of just drive, you get dropped off somewhere maybe, and you don't necessarily own your own car. So density and walkability are, could be further enabled in the model where you own your own autonomous vehicle. That creates a lot of issues, and hopefully that is not the model that our world comes to, but that would definitely create more, and require more parking, because everyone would then have their own autonomous vehicle, and what would it do when it's not dropping you off? It's free to circle the block forever. And so, that would increase traffic. And so, there's a lot of conversations about those different models. I will say though, that with autonomous vehicles, they would take up less room in a parking garage than a normal car, because you wouldn't have to have the room to, for the doors to go out. So they could be more efficient in that way, but there's still a lot of different models being thrown out there in different scenarios. So Lindsay, do you have anything?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that all the advancements in technology that we've seen have really improved the driving experience for a lot of people, but the idea of a car that completely drives itself is the timeline keeps getting pushed further and further, because there are so many complexities when you're in a city environment of different things that could be around the car and the safety concerns. And so I'm a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to seeing our streets being taken over by autonomous self-driving cars, of how quickly that could be implemented. But I do think, things like lane correction, that is definitely helping the drivers that we have today.
Thank you for that. We actually still have more questions. So another one is, what are some organizations that can help developers determine the correct amount of parking? Or correct in quotes?
Parking Reform Network. That's a good way to start, or place to start. I would also say Strong Towns is a really helpful resource for, you know, developers and looking at those items. You know, the best way to help developers determine the correct amount of parking is to, you know, do their own kind of study at the local level, not necessarily how many parking spaces they built at the same size of their target in a different city, but, you know, looking at what the needs of that community are, and doing a very, you know, quick parking study of, you know, developments nearby, and see how much space is actually used as opposed to how many spaces are there. I would recommend, you know, doing that and going to, you know, the website of the Parking Reform Network and learning more.
And we found, let's see, it was the Center for Neighborhood Technology did a study looking at residential parking in, I think it was in a number of different cities. It might have just been in Chicago, but they found that it really didn't matter how many spaces they provided. It was generally about 2/3 full, and that you really, you know, if you want to think about it, how many cars do you want to come there? Like, ask that question first. And the number that you provide with your use, really, it will depend on how many people live directly by you and what kind of transit and walking and biking is available nearby. There's no magic.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lindsay, because I put the link to that CNT study in the chat, and that was used to help develop the connected communities like TOD ordinance. So that was really helpful.
Thank you. And we have 2 minutes left. I don't know if you want to try answering this question. How do you overcome the challenge of adjacent businesses not wanting to share parking, even when the hours of peak demand for each other do not overlap?
Put it in the zoning code.
Well, I've seen
Yeah,
some communities, they have their own municipal shared lot. So it could be something that's not associated with your business. But if it already exists, then it's something you have to address with zoning, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, zoning is obviously the most direct way to do this, but there's, you know, I've also been parts of parking studies in which you kind of gather the businesses and you have, you know, a committee or a stakeholder group of sorts where you kind of have, you establish kind of ongoing conversations about, you know, how to approach parking that is shared, you know, because a lot of times when just like the loading zones, like if one person does it, then the next person wants to do it. And then, you know, before you know it, you have so much parking and, you know, it's only for one business at a time. So I would encourage, you know, communication between the businesses, especially those having problems, because then they could address it on a kind of in real time on an ongoing basis, as opposed to having kind of like weird passive aggressive relationships with each other through parking.
I've also heard concerns from business owners, like if they own the parking lot, they don't necessarily want to open it up because they fear liability if something were to happen outside of their hours. So there could be some sort of broader policy. I don't know if like a municipality could do something with that, but that is a concern that parking lot owners might have.
Thank you again. I think we're at a good stopping point. We have no additional questions. Thank you, Lindsay and Jane, for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us. This concludes the webinar on parking solutions for livable communities. Again, thank you to our speakers and to all of the attendees.
Thank you.
Thank you.